The Islamic Republic of Iran is facing its most serious internal crisis in decades. Across multiple provinces, protests have erupted with an intensity that has caught both the regime and international observers by surprise. What began as demonstrations against economic hardship has evolved into something far more profound, a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the theocratic government itself. In the western reaches of Iran, near the border with Iraq, events have unfolded that signal just how precarious the situation has become for those in power in Tehran. The province of Kermanshah has become the epicenter of confrontation between protesters and security forces. Two cities in particular, Abdanan and Malekshahi, have witnessed scenes that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Reports emerged that protesters had effectively taken control of parts of these urban centers, overwhelming local police presence and establishing temporary zones where the writ of the central government ceased to function. The National Council of Resistance of Iran, an opposition group in exile, released statements claiming that entire districts had fallen under protester control, with government buildings abandoned and security forces in retreat. The Iranian authorities responded to these claims with their own narrative. State-affiliated news agencies, including Tasnim, moved quickly to deny that any territory had been lost to demonstrators. According to official accounts, while there had been significant unrest and clashes, security forces maintained control throughout. Tasnim reported that an officer from the security services had been killed during confrontations with armed individuals in Malekshahi, but insisted that order had been restored through the deployment of additional personnel. The agency acknowledged that armed resistance against police and security forces was increasing, a rare admission that hinted at the severity of the situation on the ground. The conflicting accounts from opposition groups and state media reflect a broader information war being waged alongside the physical confrontations in Iran's streets. Independent verification of events inside Iran remains extraordinarily difficult. The government has imposed restrictions on internet access in affected areas, limiting the flow of images and videos that might document what is actually happening. International journalists have limited access, and local reporters face severe consequences for coverage that contradicts official narratives. What emerges is a fragmented picture, one where the truth likely lies somewhere between the triumphant claims of opposition sources and the reassuring statements from Tehran. The economic grievances driving these protests are both deep-rooted and immediate. Iran's currency, the rial, has experienced devastating devaluation over recent years, accelerating dramatically in recent months. The exchange rate against the US dollar has reached levels that make basic goods unaffordable for ordinary Iranians. Inflation has surged into triple digits by some estimates, eroding the purchasing power of families who were already struggling. Unemployment remains stubbornly high, particularly among young people who make up a significant portion of Iran's population. The promise of economic opportunity that might justify accepting political restrictions has evaporated for millions of Iranians who see their standard of living declining year after year. These economic pressures exist within a broader context of political frustration. The Islamic Republic has governed Iran since the revolution of 1979, maintaining power through a complex system that blends religious authority with electoral politics. But the system has become increasingly ossified, dominated by a narrow circle of clerics and Revolutionary Guard commanders who show little tolerance for dissent. Previous waves of protest have been met with violent crackdowns, most notably in 2009 during the Green Movement and again in 2019 when demonstrations over fuel price increases led to hundreds of deaths. The memory of state violence hangs over the current protests, yet remarkably, people continue to take to the streets. The 2022 protests sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini represent a crucial precursor to today's unrest. Amini, a 22-year-old woman, died in custody after being arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Her death triggered nationwide protests that centered on women's rights and personal freedom, with female protesters defiantly removing their headscarves in public. The protests of 2022 were notable for their duration, lasting several months, and for the broad participation across different segments of Iranian society. They were also marked by a particularly harsh government response, with security forces killing hundreds of protesters and executing others after rushed trials. The current wave of demonstrations draws on the same well of frustration and courage that animated the 2022 movement, suggesting that far from crushing dissent, the crackdown may have only deepened public anger. Human rights organizations have been working to document the casualties from the ongoing protests, though their task is made difficult by government restrictions and the chaotic nature of the situation. The RANA agency, affiliated with human rights activists, has reported at least 36 deaths connected to the demonstrations. Of these confirmed fatalities, 34 were protesters and 2 were members of the security forces. Iranian authorities have acknowledged only the deaths of 3 security officers, making no official statement about civilian casualties. RANA has also documented more than 60 injuries among protesters and at least 276 arrests, though the actual numbers are almost certainly higher. BBC Persian journalists have independently confirmed the deaths of 20 individuals, identifying them by name and verifying details with family members and witnesses. The geographic spread of the casualties indicates the nationwide scope of the unrest. Human rights activists report that people have been killed in 8 different provinces, suggesting that this is not a localized disturbance but a broad-based uprising. The methods used to suppress protests have varied, but gunfire appears to have been employed with disturbing frequency. In some instances, security forces have used live ammunition directly against crowds. In others, plainclothes militia members affiliated with the Basij, a paramilitary volunteer force, have attacked demonstrators with clubs, knives, and other weapons. The violence is not random. It appears to be a deliberate strategy to terrorize the population into submission. Mahmoud Ahmari-Moghadam, director of Iran Human Rights, an organization that monitors state repression, has warned that the crackdown on those involved in the current protests could exceed previous episodes of violence. In his assessment, the regime is more unstable than it has been at any point since the revolution, and this instability makes it more dangerous, not less. A government that feels secure can afford to show restraint. A government that fears its own collapse will resort to any measure to survive. Ahmari-Moghadam noted that the Islamic Republic is seriously concerned about its own survival, a concern that manifests in increasingly brutal tactics against those who challenge its authority. These concerns about regime stability are not unfounded speculation. There have been reports, emerging from sources with connections inside Iran's security establishment, that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has ordered the development of contingency plans for his own evacuation from Tehran, should the protests overwhelm the security forces' ability to maintain control. Such planning would represent an extraordinary development, indicating that even at the highest levels of government, there is recognition that the current system may not survive intact. The Supreme Leader has ruled Iran for more than 3 decades, positioning himself as the ultimate authority in both religious and political matters. The possibility of his fleeing the capital would represent a collapse of the entire power structure that has defined Iran since 1979. The international dimension of Iran's crisis cannot be ignored. The country faces not only internal unrest but external pressure from multiple directions. Iran's nuclear program has been a source of international tension for years, with Western powers imposing sanctions designed to limit Tehran's ability to develop nuclear weapons capability. These sanctions have contributed significantly to Iran's economic difficulties, restricting access to international banking systems and limiting oil exports, the country's primary source of revenue. The sanctions create a vicious cycle where economic hardship fuels protests, which in turn prompt crackdowns that invite more sanctions, further damaging the economy. The geopolitical situation has become even more complex with recent military developments. There have been reports of strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, though details remain murky and contested. These attacks, whether carried out by regional adversaries or other actors, have damaged Iran's nuclear infrastructure and killed personnel associated with the program. The Iranian government has been circumspect in its response, reluctant to acknowledge the full extent of the damage or to identify who it holds responsible. This reticence likely stems from a calculation that admitting vulnerability would further embolden both internal dissidents and external enemies. American policy toward Iran has oscillated wildly over the past several years, reflecting the broader instability in U.S. foreign policy. The Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear agreement negotiated under President Obama, reimposing sanctions and adopting what it called a maximum pressure campaign. The Biden administration sought to revive diplomacy and potentially restore some version of the nuclear deal, though these efforts ultimately stalled. With Donald Trump returning to the presidency in January 2025, U.S. policy has once again shifted toward confrontation. Trump has made statements suggesting that the United States might intervene militarily to support Iranian protesters if the regime's violence against civilians continues. Trump's comments on social media platform Truth Social were characteristically blunt. He wrote that if Iran opened fire on peaceful protesters and brutally murdered them, as it routinely does, the United States would come to their aid. He claimed that America was fully prepared and ready to act. The statement was deliberately ambiguous about what form such aid might take. It could mean additional sanctions, covert support for opposition groups, cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure, or even direct military action. The ambiguity itself may be intentional, designed to create uncertainty in Tehran about what consequences might follow from a violent crackdown. The prospect of American intervention adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. For many Iranians, particularly those old enough to remember the 1953 coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh with American and British assistance, U.S. involvement in their country's internal affairs carries a bitter historical resonance. Even Iranians who oppose the current government may view American interference with suspicion, seeing it as motivated by Washington's strategic interests rather than genuine concern for Iranian people. At the same time, the knowledge that the international community is watching may provide some protection for protesters, even if that protection is more psychological than material. Within Iran, the protests have taken on characteristics that distinguish them from earlier waves of unrest. There is a notable absence of unified leadership or clear organizational structure. This is both a strength and a weakness. The lack of identifiable leaders makes it difficult for security forces to decapitate the movement through targeted arrests, as they have done in past uprisings. But it also means there is no one who can negotiate with the government or channel the protests towards specific achievable demands. The demonstrations appear to be largely spontaneous and locally organized, erupting in response to immediate triggers, but drawing on accumulated grievances that have been building for years. The generational dimension of the protests is particularly striking. Young Iranians, those who have come of age entirely under the Islamic Republic, appear to be at the forefront of the demonstrations. They have no memory of the revolution or the Shah who preceded it. What they know is a system that has failed to deliver on its promises, that restricts their personal freedom, limits their economic opportunities, and responds to criticism with violence. This generation is also more connected to the outside world through social media and satellite television, aware of how people live in other countries, and increasingly unwilling to accept the justifications offered by their rulers for Iran's isolation and economic struggles. Women continue to play a central role in the protests, building on the momentum established during the demonstrations following Mahsa Amini's death. The mandatory hijab has become a potent symbol of state control over personal autonomy. Women removing their headscarves in public represents not just a fashion choice, but a fundamental rejection of the government's authority to dictate how individuals present themselves. The regime understands this symbolism, which is why the morality police were temporarily stood down during the height of the 2022 protests, only to be gradually reintroduced as the government reasserted control. The ongoing defiance around hijab enforcement indicates that many Iranian women are no longer willing to submit to this form of regulation, regardless of the consequences. The ethnic and regional dimensions of the current unrest also merit attention. Iran is a multi-ethnic state, with Persian speakers constituting perhaps 60% of the population and significant minorities including Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baloch, and others. Historically, these minority communities have faced discrimination and underdevelopment, with resources concentrated in Tehran and other major Persian-speaking cities. Some of the most intense protests have occurred in areas with large Kurdish, Arab, and Baloch populations, suggesting that ethnic grievances are intertwined with the broader economic and political complaints. The government has at times tried to portray unrest in these regions as separatist movements encouraged by foreign powers, but this narrative has become harder to sustain when protests are also occurring in ethnically Persian areas. The role of Iran's security apparatus in either sustaining or undermining the regime will likely prove decisive. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stands as the most powerful institution in Iran, controlling not only military forces, but also vast economic enterprises. The IRGC has a direct stake in the survival of the current system, as regime change would almost certainly mean the dismantling of its economic empire and the potential prosecution of its commanders for human rights abuses. The regular army, known as the Artesh, has a more complicated relationship with the regime. While it has generally remained loyal, there are questions about how far its rank and file soldiers would go in suppressing their fellow citizens. The police and Basij militia have been at the forefront of the crackdown, but they too are drawn from Iranian society and may have family members among the protesters. There have been unconfirmed reports of defections and refusals to follow orders within the security forces, though verification is impossible given the information environment. If such defections were to occur on a large scale, it could represent a tipping point beyond which the regime could not survive. Historical precedents from other countries suggest that revolutions often succeed not when protesters overpower security forces through violence, but when those forces decide they are no longer willing to defend an unpopular government. Whether Iran is approaching such a moment remains uncertain, but the frequency with which the possibility is discussed suggests that both the government and protesters recognize its importance. The international community's response to the crisis has been cautious and fragmented. European governments have condemned the violence against protesters and imposed sanctions on Iranian officials deemed responsible for human rights abuses. But Europe also has complex economic relationships with Iran and fears that the country's collapse could trigger refugee flows and regional instability that would affect European interests. Regional powers have their own calculations. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, longtime adversaries of Iran, might welcome the weakening of the Islamic Republic, but they also worry about the precedent of popular uprisings toppling governments. Israel has supported protesters verbally and may be providing covert assistance, seeing an opportunity to neutralize its primary regional adversary. Russia and China, both of which have strategic partnerships with Iran, have remained largely silent, unwilling to abandon an ally but also reluctant to be seen as endorsing violent repression. The question of what comes after the Islamic Republic, should it fall, remains largely unexamined in the heat of the moment. Iran's opposition is deeply fragmented, divided among monarchists who support the exiled son of the former Shah, various republican factions, ethnic nationalist movements, leftist groups, and others. There is no consensus on what a post-Islamic Republic Iran would look like, and the absence of such consensus could lead to chaos and potentially civil conflict if the current government collapses without a clear successor. The experience of other countries in the region, where the overthrow of authoritarian regimes led to prolonged instability, offers a cautionary tale. Yet the alternative, the indefinite continuation of a system that has clearly lost legitimacy in the eyes of much of its population, seems equally untenable. For ordinary Iranians caught in the middle of this crisis, the calculations are intensely personal. Every decision to join a protest carries the risk of arrest, injury, or death. Yet staying silent means accepting a system that has failed to provide basic economic security, personal freedom, or political representation. Families are divided, with some members taking to the streets while others counsel caution. The psychological toll of living under such circumstances, never knowing when the next wave of unrest will erupt or how violently it will be suppressed, is difficult to measure but undoubtedly profound. Social trust erodes when neighbors might be informants, and when expressing political opinions, even in private settings, carries risk. The role of social media in organizing and documenting the protests has been crucial, despite government efforts to disrupt it. Encrypted messaging apps allow activists to coordinate without security services easily monitoring their communications. Videos of protests and crackdowns are shared instantly, reaching international audiences and making it harder for the government to control the narrative. At the same time, the government has developed sophisticated tools for surveillance and censorship, blocking websites, throttling internet speeds, and tracking down those who post content deemed threatening. This cat-and-mouse game between protesters and authorities plays out in the digital realm as much as in physical space. The economic pressure on the regime continues to intensify, regardless of how the protests unfold. Iran's oil exports, the backbone of government revenue, remain constrained by sanctions. The currency crisis shows no signs of abating. Foreign investment is non-existent. The government has resorted to printing money to cover budget shortfalls, further fueling inflation. Public services are deteriorating, with reports of shortages in hospitals and schools struggling to function. Infrastructure projects remain incomplete. Corruption, always present in Iranian governance, has reached levels that shock even cynical observers. The Revolutionary Guard's economic dominance means that resources are extracted not for public benefit, but for the enrichment of a narrow elite and the maintenance of the security apparatus. This economic dysfunction creates pressure that no amount of repression can fully contain. Even Iranians who might not actively support regime change find their daily lives increasingly difficult. The middle class, once a pillar of stability, has seen its savings evaporated by inflation and its prospects dimmed by lack of opportunity. Professional Iranians, doctors, engineers, and academics are leaving the country in large numbers, seeking opportunities abroad and draining Iran of human capital. This brain drain represents a long-term threat to Iran's development that may prove more consequential than any single protest movement. The question of how this crisis ends remains open, with scenarios ranging from successful government repression to gradual reform to sudden collapse. The government may succeed in violently suppressing the current protests, as it has done before, buying itself time, but at the cost of further alienating the population and storing up grievances for future explosions. Alternatively, the regime might attempt limited reforms, perhaps easing some economic restrictions or relaxing enforcement of social regulations, in hopes of taking the edge off public anger without fundamentally altering the power structure. Such reforms, however, might unleash demands for deeper change that the system cannot accommodate while remaining intact. The most dramatic scenario involves the relatively rapid collapse of the Islamic Republic, whether through military defection, leadership fracture, or simply the inability of the state to continue functioning in the face of widespread resistance. International observers and intelligence agencies are closely monitoring indicators that might signal which direction Iran is heading. The health and decision-making capacity of the supreme leader, now in his mid-80s, is one such indicator. The cohesion of the Revolutionary Guard leadership is another. The extent to which protests can be sustained over time, rather than flaring up and then subsiding as economic or political pressure briefly eases, will determine whether this represents a true revolutionary moment or simply another in a series of crises that the regime has weathered. The international context matters as well, particularly whether external pressure in the form of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or military threats intensifies at a moment when the government is most vulnerable. What is clear is that Iran has reached a critical juncture. The social contract between government and governed, never strong under the Islamic Republic, has effectively broken down. The regime's legitimacy, once partially sustained by revolutionary ideology and religious authority, now rests almost entirely on coercion. A system maintained primarily through fear is inherently fragile, as the history of the 20th century demonstrates. The courage of Iranians who continue to protest despite knowing the risks they face speaks to a determination that cannot be easily suppressed. Whether that determination will be sufficient to overcome a security apparatus that retains formidable resources remains to be seen. As events continue to unfold, the situation remains fluid, with protests ongoing in multiple Iranian provinces despite violent government suppression. At least 36 deaths have been confirmed by human rights organizations, though the actual toll may be higher. Cities like Abdanan and Malekshahi in Kermanshah Province have seen particularly intense confrontations between protesters and security forces. This account draws primarily on reporting from human rights monitoring organizations, including Prana and Iran Human Rights, statements from the National Council of Resistance of Iran, coverage from BBC Persian, and official Iranian government media, including Tasnim News Agency, supplemented by international news analysis and recent policy statements from American officials.